Yeah,
Hello.
well, hello, and welcome to the third episode of our meditation podcast in English. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, we always, I don't know how many episodes we have to start by mentioning that this is our meditation pod in English because we have already done one in Swedish. But well, anyways, for anyone who wants to also hear the one in Swedish, it's available on Spotify and it's called Meditationspodden. But this is our podcast in English. So today, should we for anybody who hasn't seen us, my name is Jan Brunt, and
My name is Louisa Blumenthal.
we are both meditation yoga teachers from Finland, and we don't speak Finnish as our mother tongue. That's why we don't have the typical Finnish accent. But let's move on from the language question. Uh, what are we supposed to talk about today?
Today we're gonna tackle the topic of the many phases of yoga, the
Mm,
different
mm,
aspects of yoga, since
mm,
the word yoga is in itself such a concise and small word, but it contains so many meanings, or people tie so many different meanings to it, and there's so many various understandings of what yoga is. We thought we'd just reflect on that a bit.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, as an example, I can mention that we had the retreat a couple of months ago, and I was telling a friend of mine about the retreat. I mentioned that we're going to have this yoga retreat, and my friend was like, "Oh, so what will you be doing there?" And I was like, I will be teaching there." Oh, so it's a yoga and meditation retreat. And I was like, "Well, yeah." And I think this is kind of this kind of pictures like this a bit narrow understanding of the word yoga, which we want to kind of get a bit away from today. So, starting with this, I mean, the thing that perhaps many people think about when they hear yoga is like a light form of gymnastics. So, if we would put a name on that, what would be like? I mean, we if we say like, well, this is a kind of it's a kind of yoga, yes, but this is the kind of yoga that we would call. What do you think is like the best name for this? That
I think we've been calling it classical yoga. We've been calling it tantric yoga, hatha yoga. But the
Mhm,
point is, it's a holistic system. It's not just the physical aspect of it. It's not just the asana part, the physical postures and movements. So when we say yoga, we're talking about not only the physical body putting it in certain positions, but really a system that's targeting your whole being, and all of that is yoga
mhm.
as far as we've been, yeah, taught, and as far as we understand it, isn't it?
Yeah, now thinking, should we like kind of try to track down, like first of all, like how did we get to the point where I think a quite huge part of the like general public and perhaps also you watching this thinks of yoga as just this physical, just this asana part. Now, uh, how did we get there, and how do we kind of crawl our way back through history and find all the other forms and see how they're connected with this part? So mm, nowadays, I mean, of course, there is this knowledge. I mean, of course, the teachers that teach yoga, they know that okay, they are if they are teaching like a asana part, the physical part, like more like a light gymnastic part of the yoga, they usually are quite aware of it, and they also like signal this in the name. So they might call it hatha yoga, for example, to kind of show that this is more like physical part of yoga, and Ashtanga yoga today. I mean, the today the name Ashtanga yoga in quite like it's quite much a word that is used for well a very kind of physical yoga. Now this is confusing as this isn't really kind of the original meaning of the word Ashtanga in
Mm.
Ashtanga yoga. So how do we how do we
How do we
make like
understand this confusion?
yes, how do you
Yeah.
understand this confusion?
Well,
So
I
let
think we have to, yeah, I think we have to basically trace back the practice that we see today to how it's originated or how it's been spread and made popular. Because for those who are now practicing yoga, I mean, those who've been around, maybe born in the 40s, 50s, they probably are very well aware that there was a time when yoga was not a thing, not a boom or a trend in the Western world. And for the generation that's maybe grown up in the 80s, 90s, and further on, it may be that there's this kind of feeling that yoga has always been around as sort of a easily accessible hobby. And as a matter of fact, it's basically in the 90s, around when yoga started to really blow up here in the northern countries at least. And before that, you had to be very, I would say, um, very niched to get into the yoga scene, because it was a rather esoteric thing.
mm,
And that's basically also, I think, how it started off spreading from India mainly, of course, and to the rest of the world. Um, you being the historian of us, of the two of us, you having more of that knowledge, maybe want to go into the specifics of how it's developed, if you want to.
yeah, well, I'm actually wondering if I'm hugely good at that, but uh, I think in a way that what has happened with yoga, with if we're thinking from like the 19th century, which is like it's confusing because in Swedish we usually talk about like we say the 1800s instead, but like the 19th century, the 1800s, uh, when like yoga was getting into uh, at all the like the sphere of Western European, uh, also like Western American, but anyways like the Western kind of conscience. And that was like, of course, then at that time India was still a part or like, well, a colony, if we could say so. I don't know if that's the correct word, but anyways, they were under the rule of Britain. And there was some interest. I mean, there were interest towards the rich culture of India in some like we could call them perhaps a bit more enlightened parts of the Western society. Uh,
Orientalism was a big thing.
yeah, it was, and there also perhaps was this streak of trying to kind of also a bit more like kind of mysticize it, which had, I think, good sides and then perhaps bad sides as well. Um, but I would say that perhaps what happened during that time was that also there was this strive from Indians and from like yoga teachers to try and show that yoga isn't that exotic a thing. And I wonder if perhaps that presentation sometimes has gone a bit too far. And I mean, now that's a long process. I mean, they kind of emphasize the fact that, hey, there's all this uh, just like physical practice in yoga. There's lots of things that actually just work with your like physical strength and flexibility and physical health. And in a way, I think that the aim was to show that it's not all that mysterious and exotic. It's not only something to kind of put in some what should you call it, like some scientific studies of how different India is from everything Western. Now, of course, there is some truth that I mean, there was some truth in this kind of Orientalistic view of yoga, that yoga, well, it is there is mysticism in it, and that's a good thing, and it is actually something different from what the Western culture has to offer. But in the same way, uh, or in the same time, that also kind of risked putting yoga into a very like narrow little box. That's something that you study, but it's dangerous because it's religious, and it's not good for uh, like proper Christians to get to know it too much. But I think there was this strive to kind of emphasize from like the parts of yoga teachers that no, it's not that mystic. There's a lot of like um, yeah, well, gymnastics in it as well, and I think it might
Exactly.
have gone
And
too far in
if
a
I
way.
may chip in here,
Yeah.
it wasn't only the Western world who was interested in the Oriental world, it was the other way around as well.
Mm,
So exactly around that time that you're talking, as far as I've understood, the the yogis were also sort of getting influenced by the kind of the Western way of doing gymnastics and health care and whatever, and that was a quite military inspired approach to how to take care of your body. If you look at old videos of gymnasts, it was a very sort of um, structured and quite rigid way of approaching how to strengthen the body, how to practice. And
mm,
if I've understood correctly, yoga took many influences from that style of doing gymnastics. So there's actually exactly around that time when you're talking about the 19th century, around that time, it's been like sort of a fusion also. Not only has yoga started to sort of seep out into the Western society, but also the Western society has started to seep into the yoga, creating this kind of mixture. And many of these big names, the teachers who proceeded to create their own yoga systems, which of course to some degree has always been present because yoga is a tradition that's been passed on from teacher to student and so on and so on. So there's always someone who puts their own kind of touch when they pass it on. But I think for the first time there was like this branded kind of yoga coming up, and that was as early as in the late 19th century. Already then the big sort of gurus started to market their yoga as a certain style, and I think that's what then just continued to happen throughout the 20th century, and well, obviously in this day that's why there's so many different yoga styles.
mhm. Yeah, and I mean it's interesting because it's of course hard to tell what the development would have been if it wouldn't have been for this like huge impact from like being subjugated to the British Empire, which was I mean, it wasn't a really great trade-off at all for India. So of course, I mean, that influenced a lot, and it's really hard to tell what would have happened with all this if it wouldn't have been for this like specific historical situation. But yeah, I mean, exactly as you said, there was like this double influence. There was also this interest from the yoga side to look into, okay, so they're doing stuff differently, and I also have this picture from I mean from what I read and from some thinkers within yoga that I have like gotten to know a bit better, that there also was this thought of that uh, that the like some that the Indian way that the Indian way had gotten a bit too much emphasized on the calm and the peace, while the Western dynamic, active, dominant culture uh, that like had something that yoga and the Indian thinking needed to get influences from. And of course, I mean, this probably was influenced from the fact that this huge subcontinent had gotten quite like badly dominated by still what is like a much smaller country like Britain. So I think it's quite understandable this psychology that also might have developed from this. That okay, we have to learn from this because from for some reason, these people managed to actually just make us their, like, what's the right word, I don't know, but like the subjects, they're well, colonize and well, if we are to be honest, just like extract a lot of riches from this huge country. So I think this had some psychological impact. And well, what this led to, as you said, there were both well, these new kind of yoga brands and empires coming out. And I think that might also have been a part of trying to get your yoga into the Western market. Then you had to also adapt this idea of having a brand and having like a business structure, because that was how the Western market worked.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of something that you once mentioned. I don't remember if it was it Sri Yukteswar who used to say it, this thing about economical independence.
Yeah,
You might
exactly.
wanna quote it since you probably know it better.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because if we look at like what are the big names coming out of India, like in the late 19th century. So one of them is, of course, then Paramahansa Yogananda, who then wrote a book that we have mentioned, well, earlier in a Swedish podcast, which we have discussed like from different angles, but it's called Autobiography of a Yogi. And it then tells about, he there tells about his life trying to export yoga to, well, mostly the US, because he then moved to California actually. And this was like early 20th century, so the early 1900s. Yeah, well, he had a teacher called Sri Yukteswar, or that was his guru, his like teacher, his real teacher. And Sri Yukteswar explained to Paramahansa Yogananda, which he then tells about in his book, that it's very important. And I think this is, I mean, considering the situation of like modern yoga teachers, it's kind of hard to realize in practice. But he said that it's very important for yoga teacher to be economically independent, because otherwise you will have to bow to the wishes of your students. Now, if you're economically independent, you can be like a real teacher. You can, tell them off that you're no good. You have to do everything you can. The kind of teaching that the both of us have had the, well, I don't know, what should you say, pleasure, honor to experience. But I mean the classic way where actually you also, I mean, you actually get a tough guidance, and that has changed a lot, of course, when the teacher turns into like, just a seller that have to, like, well, in practice, probably, I mean, of course, if you have a really long relationship also with a modern teacher at a modern yoga school, well, probably you can also accept the fact that, okay, sometimes the teachers tells you a bit more strict feedback that you're not doing this right, you should be doing this really different. But I mean, I think most of the time teachers have to kind of, well, they have to more like please their students. They have to know that also this session was a nice and well, pleasant
Rewarding.
experience. Yeah, and I think that's a problem, because I mean, as we have seen, really kind of working and getting into the deeper parts of yoga, it might require also a bit more like strict teaching, and
Yeah, and it's not even about the sort of, I think, the strictness in itself. I mean,
mm,
teachers are different in personality and style, and we've both had strict guidance as well.
mm,
But I think the main part is that if you're only coming to yoga to seek an enjoyable experience, like a
mm,
nice feeling, a little sort of cherry on the top kind of thing for your day, then of course, if you get someone who's telling you, okay, you want to feel good about your life, well, have you looked at yourself? Have you looked at how you're living life? have you looked at this and this and this? It doesn't even
mm,
have to be strict, but just showing that reality might not be always like a pleasant experience. And then if you're thinking like, I'm not going to give my money to someone who's like not giving me a good time, then
mm,
obviously you're only going to get that, sort of guidance that someone who'd never, you know, goes beneath the surface can give. And I think that's part of why at least a few of my teachers have been so frustrated, and probably, with good reason, about this trending of yoga, that it has become like, yeah, like we concluded a business basically for so many. And I mean, we all have this sort of dilemma. How do you live and teach yoga in a world where yogis are not, just by social status, supposed to be there and be around, and people, want to keep them around.
mm,
So then, yeah, then you have to sort of weigh between this thing, like what's actually, and we talked about this before we started recording, like what's, for example, recording this podcast, what is the aim? Are
mm,
we wanting to please people? And in that case, we would have to, of course, conform what we talk about according to what the mainstream listener is interested in hearing. Or do we want to actually just expound into this topic of what is yoga, and then those who listen, listen? And that's how traditionally yoga has been imparted. It's like there's a teacher, and of course, there are many teachers, so it's not like anyone has to, choose that particular teacher, but you give what you have, and the student comes and absorbs. And it's not this sort of, that my teacher used to call spiritual shopping, that you go like here and there and you pick pieces from different places. So, and I'm not saying again that yoga teachers today are wanting this scenario, but it's a dilemma that exists because of this, um, yeah, businessification of yoga.
mm.
And
Yeah.
not everyone has the possibilities that Sri Yukteswar had, of getting a big inheritance, and you can sit and like just teach without any concern of, is there anyone who's coming and like actually paying for their classes. But ideally, of course, there would be no economic interest in sharing these things.
Mm,
And yeah, so I guess that's part of what's been happening during this time of people having teaching yoga as a vocation. And I still think that's very important if you want to be a yoga teacher. Now, maybe I'm going into another topic here, but um, but tying it back to why yoga is what it is today, I think that's a big part.
mm. Yeah, and also I would say that well, if we are thinking about then how did we get to the stage where we are today, where well, a lot of people associate the word yoga then to the parts that well, correctly could be called more like hatha yoga, perhaps like the physical side of it. um, and I think it's a lot about that what is kind of not so threatening in a way to how people are living, what is not gonna like start questioning deeper values and all these parts that might actually then uh, demand the fact that the person coming to the yoga class and meeting a yoga teacher is also ready to, well, uh, kind of accept that role, that this yoga teacher might also be teaching something else than gymnastics. So I think that's the part that uh, well, I would say, and I would kind of I don't know the right word, but I would suspect that also these early teachers that probably would have wanted to really convey, as you can see in, for example, I mean, I think Paramahansa Yogananda is a good example, because I mean, if you look at his writing, his book, he is really kind of wanting to present yoga with all, like it's very broad philosophical, like depths. But I would suspect that already then, back in his days, like the parts that created the least um, like problems was to teach the physical parts. And I do kind of sense, because this is the experience that I had with my own teacher when I started studying, that like if you want to like get people interested in the depths of yoga, a safe way, like in the Western world at least, is to start with the gymnastics, and then perhaps you in some like phase, or like when you find a proper time for it, you might also start introducing the deeper parts. But for many peoples, and I think like just out of probably economical practical reasons, like also then for teachers that have themselves studied the deeper parts of yoga, it tends to then kind of remain on this level where you only look into like the physical parts of the yoga, and you don't go like into the depths of, I mean, because you can go into the depths of only like what do these physical parts of yoga actually strive for, because it's not that it's only physical. Oh, so well then it's, you know, it's just gymnastic. I mean, they also, I mean, strive for benefits that are deeper than just being flexible or like getting a good core strength or anything. They're like deeper levels to that, and even those parts might get a bit, you know, put like aside, because it's just the fact that, you know, for business it's easier to just, as you mentioned, I mean, give people a pleasant experience from coming and doing nice exercises and getting a stronger, healthier body.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I once taught or told some students when I felt that they were arriving to the point that they have had, like, they'd had sufficient of experience with the physical yoga. And well, also we had kind of been working together so long that I felt that they could take a bit more of sort of um, my kind of humor or way of putting things without getting scared. And I said, you know what? This physical yoga, that's the gateway drug. So you start with this, and then then there's so many other things that slowly we'll get into. But this is the thing that if you start with this opens up a whole, you know, new world if you want to. And I think that's in the best case what the asana, the physical postures can do. It can give a change in someone's experience or state that maybe if they started off with, you know, someone sitting down and like chanting Om and then telling
Mm,
them, you know, about different esoteric aspects, perhaps throwing in a few Sanskrit words and like something that someone feels is like Hindu gods or whatever, and then like puts them into some rigorous meditation exercise, and then they're like very thrown off by the whole thing
mm,
because they're not physically prepared to sit still. Their mind is all over the place. I know because I've been and still am very much that person. So the physical yoga, when you can lead someone who is restless or tense, just to take them into that physical state of like I wouldn't even say like well-being immediately, but even like non-suffering. That's like, I think, you know, something that makes people actually want to come back, and not out of, you know, um, fitness reasons or like these surface reasons. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong. I've started to realize I shouldn't be so arrogant to say you shouldn't do yoga for, you know, wanting to look good or like having a good posture or whatever, because for all I know, you can do yoga for whatever reason you want to. It's just good. Like whoever does yoga, like I'm happy. But I think if you actually want to have like a long-term interest, then there should be something that's even deeper. And I think that deeper motivation will start to come by itself. I have one teacher who says that never tell anyone, they should do something, but rather like let them discover. And she also told me, like, what do you feel when you do this practice? How does it feel after you've done this? And on the basis of that, like, do you want to do that again? And I think it's from that experience from the students, like, own sort of, wow, this state is so great. And some of the students tell me, like, it can last a few days after, and even the whole week until the next class. And then when you get used to that state, then you want more. And that's why it's the gateway drug, because then it's like, how do I even deepen this? When the
Mm,
physical yoga starts to feel good, like, how do I get even more into the still state, into this deep connection with who I am?
mm,
But if you start with that, then yeah, then that might scare someone away. And especially, I think it was so good that you mentioned this with, now you took the example of a good Christian, and there are many who of course are practicing any religion, and they're open to many other religions and practices. But then there might also be blockages and resistance. And then I think the physical yoga is one of the maybe most easily approachable aspects, because the way we've been taught, you don't have to have any sort of dogmatic indoctrination in the yogic process to get results or to get sort of a change in your state or perception.
mm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. No, we really should get to the subject, or
Yes.
though. No, but yeah, I'm kind of a bit, I'm kidding, because we are on the subject, but I think we're leading people a bit around, because
Beating
uh,
around the bush.
yeah, we're a bit beating around the bush. No, because I mean, I think we could talk about this as I mean, just forever. Because I mean, actually looking at today, just like I mean, a couple of years ago, um, there was actually a debate in a town, like it's my hometown. I'm not going to mention, because then people will feel. I mean, a smaller town in Finland. Uh, well, small compared to what, I don't know, but in Finnish, it's a middle-sized town in Finnish proportions, which is like really, really, really small in all other countries, except for in the Nordic countries, where towns are quite small. Anyways, there was actually a debate there about a local yoga school that was offering classes to kids, and the debate was like, are you going to corrupt their souls? I mean, there were actually like several, and these were like, I mean, they weren't like mainstream Christians. They were like more into, kind of this evangelical, like really, uh, well, missionary, movement. It wasn't like the mainstream regular Lutheran church kind of goers. But anyways, there was this debate, like, are you corrupting the souls of children by teaching them yoga? And the funny thing is that I mean, technically, well, the answer could have been, well, in a way, yeah, if you see it as corruption, turning them into a tradition that might lead in the long run to them kind of getting to know like spiritual depths or philosophical depths that aren't 100% what you define as non-heretical, or like strictly by the scriptures, like by the Bible. So I think it was an interesting debate, because in the way that then the yoga school and the classes for children got defended was that, oh no, I mean, how can you say that? It's just enhancing the flexibility of the children, getting to know better their coordination. And of course, I mean, that's true. And I think it's a way, also a good example of how yoga have had to kind of, defend itself towards this kind of suspicion that there's something, it's a bit Hindu-y. There's, I mean, nowadays most Westerners are quite, open towards like mixing different spiritual heritages, but I mean, go back 50 years in time, and that is not at all the case. I mean, a lot of people would actually, uh, look at things like, I mean, is this okay in a Christian sense or not? So I think if we're looking at history, then I think that's really kind of been one of the big issues. And that brings us to the question of like, what is then all this stuff that we haven't really then called by name? So we talked about like Hatha yoga is what you perhaps then would be quite correct if you would say, well, Hatha yoga, that is the physical part. So that's more
And
like,
the
yeah,
also in the tantric, tradition, there are so many other things included in hatha yoga. It's basically um, the practice of balancing the two aspects of your being, the active and the more restful one. And maybe we can go into that in more detail in some other episode. But I just wanted to mention there's also, cleansing methods and other practices that can be put under the umbrella of hatha. But yes,
yeah. So I mean, yeah, even talking about Hatha is a bit, kind of too narrow, like what you actually look into. But anyways, but so that's where we kind of, we can kind of say that, well, if you're talking about Hatha yoga, it's quite correct. It's mostly correct to think that that's the asanas, the like more physical parts. But even if we look at Ashtanga yoga nowadays, perhaps I think quite often looked upon as the like even a bit more gymnastic, tough kind of physical yoga. At least there are quite, I mean, physically demanding series in Ashtanga yoga. The root of Ashtanga, the name Ashtanga, actually comes from then 8 limbs, Asht, 8, Anga, limbs. And these 8 limbs, within those, like when we're talking about 8 limbs, we're talking about 8 like different parts of the yoga. I think asanas is probably like one of these limbs, and then there's 7 others. I mean, like for example, I think pranayama, like breathing exercises, and then there's different. I think within the Ashtanga, I now remember them correctly. There are different parts, even like different parts of the like meditational side of yoga is listed as different limbs. I mean, like zoning out completely is one, like dhyana, and just like removing your like contact with your senses, pratyahara, is another limb. So these are also like different limbs, which goes to shows that in like the classical understanding of Ashtanga, the asanas, the physical part, is, well, technically 1/8 of the whole.
yes.
So like,
And there's like, so what you're talking about, that Ashtanga is, if I'm understanding what you're talking about correctly, you're talking about Patanjali's
yeah,
definition, and from his treatise, the Yoga Sutras, where he goes through these different limbs. And there's his definition, which is a pretty, one could say, orthodox classical definition of the 8 limbs, and then also there's a tantric variation of that same, which then, instead of, since he starts out like before you even go into the physical part, he says, work on your moral, ethical, social, like, way of being and handling your life, and then when you've perfected those, then you go over to the practice. Whereas the tantrics, they say that you don't have to be a perfect human being to start doing yoga. Just start by, purifying your body and doing postures and breathing and everything, and then that, conduct of your moral values and so on will like correct itself. So when you, sorry.
some tantrics, for example, my teacher was not of this opinion. He was very strict with the moral and social rules you're talking about. Those are called yama and niyama, and
Yes.
that there was that went very much hand in hand. If you're going to kind of start meditation, you have to also very strictly adhere and learn the rules and adhere to the rules.
So
So
that goes to
this,
show that there's many approaches to this,
yeah,
to this topic. And I definitely think, that one that your teacher was following was the more sort of traditional one, and the one that's more propagated. I think, I think probably this other one, maybe, I don't know, the teachers who came up with this variation maybe just felt that that was either for their students' sake, putting a lot of pressure and making people feel really guilty, and hence said, like, listen, it's okay if you're, once in a while you can't maintain a full detachment from material possessions, for example, but like just do your meditation, it'll like you'll get there. So that's my theory, that there's been, some sort of just wanting to not set the bar so high that people never start. Um,
mm,
but never mind that. So yes, there's these like that eight limb system is just kind of a way to illustrate how rich the whole practice of yoga, what we call yoga, is. And did we
mm.
at some point in the two previous episodes, did we mention what yoga is? The word yoga.
I think we might have. I'm not sure. I mean, just repeat it anyways.
So if we
So,
go by the very sort of generic definition of like union,
mhm,
then anything basically within this system of yoga is designed to bring you closer into union with whatever you want to call it, yourself, your higher self, uniting body and mind, soul, spirit, whatever view that fits your sort of understanding. It's about like uniting into a whole, into a like complete maybe being or existence or experience.
mm,
So then I think it's pretty logical that it isn't enough to only focus on the physical body, because we're not only physical beings. We also have so many other dimensions.
mm,
So I think that's maybe we should bridge over from here into like how we didn't really go through the eight limbs specifically, like all the
mm,
parts, but you mentioned a few. And to make it maybe very simple, you can say there's the physical, the practices that target the physical body, and those are from the yamas and niyamas. Well, those are not really physical, those are maybe like
no,
preliminary. But then you go, like you mentioned, detaching the senses, pratyahara, all the way up until there, and then you move sort of into the more internal aspects of concentration and meditation. And in that way, according to Patanjali, you sort of cover all bases.
mm,
And then there are so many personality types that maybe for all, it isn't like an even distribution of like you do 5 minutes asana, you do 5 minutes pranayama, then you do this and that. But maybe someone is more inclined to a certain type of practice. And then that's where we come into the different, I would say, types of yoga that we maybe also should talk about.
mhm. Yeah, and I would just like add one thing when you talk about unity, or when we talk about unity. I think that's one important thing. I mean, actually, then in this Ashtanga like system, or just like description of what all is a part of yoga, because I think description is better, because it's actually a well, an attempt to describe all the different parts of yoga, or how, in which all ways you can try to strive to union. Morals, which is then called yama and niyama, uh, are actually a part of it. So I mean, there's actually like a social aspect of it, and that, I think, that is one of the aspects is that is like really um, gone in like the very like hardly westernized view of yoga, which also leads to then the problem of people accusing yoga of being everything. You're just focusing on yourself. You are like, you're staring into your own what's it called, navel.
Navel gazing.
Yeah, because of course, if you leave out the fact that there's also this idea of how you act as a social person and how you act towards others, where, I mean, you know, like there's all these rules about non-violence and so forth. If you leave them out, or if you don't look at them, then of course you might get the picture that the only idea in yoga is it's all about yourself. It's not about like everything else. And I think one then like understanding of unity, like yoga as unity, it's also I mean it's also unity towards like really your like concrete physical social environment, but there's a depth to it that is kind of perhaps then, you know, it, it would be, I mean, you can't leave out the fact that there's also then this deeper side to also that idea and that thought. But I think the social moral side of yoga is quite often just like forgotten in the Western world. But yeah, I mean, different types of yoga for different persons. Please expand
Yeah.
on this.
No, I still, that was an interesting thing you said.
We should
Mm,
mark this down in the like the description of this podcast. There will be an interesting thing said like 40 minutes into the episode.
one interesting thing.
Yeah. No, well, please, no. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think
No.
maybe, I'm still wondering if we should go into the details of what this system is, since we've just like been so vague about it. So if we just like quickly go through the eight limbs, if there's
Mhm,
someone who's like, please, you're being so confusing about this. So according to the classical or the orthodox eight limbs, it would
mm,
start with the yamas and niyamas, the social and moral conducts. And like you mentioned, there's, for example, there's the ahimsa, the non-violence, there's the asteya, the non-theft or not taking what's not yours, and there's aparigraha, not like non-possessiveness or attachment, and there are many other sort of things that probably are rooted in many cultures just as like part of either the religious doctrine or just in the social sort of law and order part. But there's also things according like pertaining to yourself, like cleanliness or uh, truthfulness and so on. So that's the yamas and niyamas, not all of them, but that's a few. And then you would have the asana, the physical yoga. Then you would have the pranayama, the breathing exercises. And then actually, I'm not sure because, again, I remember this sort of less orthodox aspect. What would come in this orthodox one? Because what I would have next is the mudras and the bandhas, but that's a strictly tantric one. So
mhm.
is that also what you were taught, or?
I mean, yeah, well, I would say that the following one, which I like view as a part of the like classical Ashtanga, I would think that would be then you were into pranayama as the last
Yeah.
one you mentioned. Yeah. So I think the next one would be pratyahara, because then we're
Okay.
kind of moving into the meditational,
Yes.
in a way, side of the system. So I think this next one would be pratyahara, and that is yeah,
And
well, that
pratyahara
is
was the detaching of the senses from the
detaching of the
surroundings.
senses.
So that's a
Yeah.
very also traditional way to say it, but maybe we can elaborate later on these practices. And then
Yeah.
you would come into,
Well, then it gets kind of, I would say, like cleaving. I don't, do you use this word in English, like cleaving hairs? Because it gets like you have to be kind of think technically, like a bit more kind of knowledgeable about meditation to understand the differences between these last ones. But the next one would be like dharana. Well, I mean, it's easy to explain. That's more like the concentration, like concentrating your mind, trying to capture your mind in some kind of way. There are different, of course, techniques to it. And then the following one would be dhyana, which is then, well, it then gets into kind of prolonging this concentration and this pratyahara when it starts to get something that you can actually evolve into something more kind of continuous. Well, we're getting really like into describing parts of meditation here, so it's interesting because that also started like that started from like pratyahara, so half of these limbs are actually describing parts of meditation. The last eighth limb then being samadhi, and that is like total absorption or total transcendence. So for many people that would be like, you know, the goal of meditation or whatever you want to call it, or just like a side of meditation, which can be quite nice, but you know, anyways. So
So
yeah.
yeah, so just to get a bit of a sort of overview of these things, but these were like,
Mm,
this is such a, just like a little presentation of like the outlines. So maybe we should get into that more in detail at some other point to what
yeah.
actually these things are about.
Hmm.
Um, but then, yeah, so what I was mentioning regarding different personalities, since you can divide yoga into different parts according to this system, and I would say this is quite I don't know if you agree, but this would be quite a Raja yogic system to
Hmm.
follow. So now we get into the different, maybe you could call them genres or like schools of yoga, because there are obviously going to be teachers who are more drawn to different aspects. And the Raja Yoga, which is the royal yoga, it's a very systematic and sort of yeah, straightforward, like methodologic way to approach how to work with yourself. And it involves the, yeah, well, all of these eight limbs basically, as far as I'm concerned, with maybe with more focus on the meditation and the mind too. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, at least as I have understood it, behind the concept of Raja Yoga is that you are doing this, like the earlier limbs we mentioned, you are doing those so that you can then kind of like reach your goal within meditation. So so there is this certain kind of emphasis then on meditation in how at least I have understood Raja Yoga concept. But yeah.
Yeah. So systematic and structured and kind of goal oriented in that sense of reaching, like through practice of methods, reaching this state of union.
No. And the fact that they call it Raja Yoga, like royal yoga, you hear that there's kind of this idea that there's a hierarchy. There is something that is like not as royal yoga, and then there is royal yoga. So I haven't thought about it, but it's kind of a funny name, anyways. But you know, yeah, the huge tradition, and I respect it very much. And I would kind of look at my own like kind of teachers as being very kind of fond of the whole Raja Yoga concept. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm.
So we have the Raja Yoga, and then what other schools do we have? We have the Bhakti Yoga, for example,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that's the yoga of devotion. So, for example, if you look at some of the big poets or musicians of the yogic tradition, you would find many Bhakti yogis who are, they're not maybe so invested in how long they can sit still in an asana, or if they are able to go through all the different stages of samadhi with fine precision and name them different things, like Patanjali was doing, really like a scientist mapping everything. But they're more concerned with how absorbed they can become in the object of their longing. So, for example, if you look at Mirabai, who was a poet, now I can't exactly remember when, I might say completely off, but I would say 15th century maybe, or
Yeah,
14th
it's
century India.
yeah,
And she would basically, like, I think in her time, be seen as like a bit of a nutcase. Um, she would go around and just sing and recite poetry to Krishna, who was her, her beloved. And that was her way of reaching this union with whatever is, perceived
mm,
as the highest reality.
mm,
And through that love, through that devotion, nothing else was like important. I doubt that she was, or well, what do I know? But I doubt that she was focusing a lot on rigorous systems. Maybe she might have, but the emphasis, at least for the bhakti, is the devotion itself. And through that love, through that devotion, conjuring the energy that will make you transcend your daily sort of state.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I mean, when we talk about Bhakti Yoga, then we are really talking about what I think a lot of people, like, first of all, they don't realize that this is a huge tradition within yoga. Like, we're actually then talking about, I mean, using the word yoga for this might for a lot of people be kind of really feel like strange or like alien, because that's not what they used to think about when they think about yoga. So it's a huge tradition within yoga, and I think it's also the part of yoga which a lot of a lot of people quite correctly in a way might feel that it's kind of religious. I mean, it's what they perceive as religion, or is close to what they are used to talking about as religion. So, for example, you mentioned Mirabai, and that you would sing to Krishna. So then we mentioned Christians, so we could also kind of mention like something that people might see out in like the streets today, even if I think they're not as usual. I mean, I don't think I see them as much as I did like 10 or 15 years ago. But anyways, like the so-called Hare Krishna movement, which aren't actually called the Hare Krishna movement, but that's the name that they used for them. Um, I think they called ISKCON. Actually, that's like their real abbreviation. I don't know. I don't remember the exact like meaning of the words. But anyways, those I think many perceive them as like some kind of crazy cult, like in the Western world. They're like some crazy cult. I mean, people getting fooled into like leaving all the possessions and wearing these strange orange clothes and just singing and singing. It's like, that's terrible. It's a cult. But the fact is, I mean, they're really classical Vaishnavis. They're actually like following a branch within Hinduism, for one thing. That's quite like like clear. That's really kind of, it's just like really orthodox branch within Hinduism that then focus on Krishna. But it's also a form of yoga. This is a form of yoga. This is a way of striving towards unity by like by using in a way, or like focusing. uh, I don't know how to say this without kind of making it sound too technical. That's perhaps because I'm not much of a bhakti yogi myself, which can't be said about you. But anyways, but I want to kind of describe it in a way that makes kind of, in a way, you kind of, I mean, unity is also a thing that, I mean, you could also describe as finding like love within existence. I mean, finding in which way existence is also like all about love. So I mean, you might say anything you want about the Beatles and being kind of tripping out on LSD. They weren't really kind of missing the point in their India kind of travels at all, because that was really kind of bhakti yoga that they were getting like to know better.
And I
Uh,
think the only issue, if I may come in here, like regarding the religious aspect, I think the only
mm,
issue with um if there ever is issues with bhakti yoga, which there obviously can be when it
mm,
turns, like you say, it may even be turn into a cult, and a person cult for all I know, when
mm,
people start attaching that devotion, because devotion is a strong emotion, and I think people inherently, at least many, have that desire to feel love. And I'm not talking about this like Hollywood romantic love, but actually this love that is mind blowing, literally mind blowing, like when it blows away all your preconceptions and all your limitations. I think people have a desire to experience transcendence. So when people place that longing into something that is finite, into something that is, for example, a human being, which may or may not be worthy, so to say, of that devotion, then you can have like really destructive things happen. Because when someone is devoted to that degree that they stop using their mind, then you can really easily start to have your own schemes and ambitions influence others in a very profound way. And I guess that's why, if people are skeptical towards bhakti yoga, that might be one reason, because devotion requires a sort of relinquishment of the logic, and that makes you vulnerable to power abuse, for example. So I think, say, Mirabai, in that sense, I think did a smart move in placing her devotion in something that's sort of beyond um, the material realm. So this may again sound very like fluffy and weird, but she didn't go and become crazy in love with her guru, for example, who might have been, then just saying like, go and wash dishes for 10 hours a day for the rest of your life, which might have been a good practice for her, for all I know. But what I'm saying is people can also do bhakti yoga in a way which isn't like necessarily connected um, to only a movement or like a society, or going into a system of any sort, but it can be more like also of an abstract thing. I just wanted to put that in there. But then of course there are so many variations of this as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, a huge part of yoga to, I mean, and you perhaps then don't associate that with doing like asanas, but it just goes to show that the family of different practices, which is a part of yoga, is really huge.
And here can
Yeah,
be
yeah.
kirtan and mantra and writing, calligraphy, or all kinds of arts can be part of this. For example, dancing. So things that maybe, like you said, are not associated with standing on a yoga mat and doing things.
Yeah, and to anyone listening to this, I would say, I mean, just try and visit sometime one of your local Hare Krishnas at their open. They usually have like once a week or something. They usually like invite anyone to come there, because it's quite interesting. I mean, if you've never done it, it's quite interesting, and they dance and sing. And of course, I mean, the thing is that I think a lot of people then get scared of is the idea that there's some kind of, there's the cult, and there's the idea of what are you kind of subjugating yourself to. And you don't have to subjugate yourself to anything. You can just sing and dance, and it can be a bit of fun. And you can
And
even think that,
yeah, you as also, like, as you mentioned, you're not much of a bhakti yogi. I definitely am drawn to that expression of union, and I think to feel bhakti, it can't be ingenuine. You have to have something that you actually genuinely want to subjugate yourself to. And that again sounds like, ooh, what do you want to subjugate yourself to? But meaning that there has to be some higher principle that you yourself feel like that's worthy to love, or that's worthy to sort of give your energy and emotion to. And then that becomes possible, because you can't, in this, you can't fool yourself. So I mean, if you
yeah,
go and see a Hare Krishna thing, you might feel like, yeah, but this is like, I'm not into this whole, show. But maybe you have something else that you feel like this is, so important in my life. And this, evokes a sense of deep connection and ecstasy, maybe even, or just like beyond myself kind of experience.
yeah. And I mean, there's also, now I'm gonna start crawling into
Good.
the like, I don't know, you could kind of call it opposite in a funny way, because it's, I mean, it's dualism is also always breached by the fact that they did the same things, but they're just like different sides of the coin. So if you flip the coin, then there's this tradition, I think in a way you could call that, called Jnana. You also you have the better pronunciation, so you
No,
could.
well, the way I learned to pronounce it was Gyan Yoga.
Jnana yoga, yeah, Jnana yoga. And if I mean, if bhakti then is the part which is kind of more let's say focusing or flowing through the feelings within a person, and kind of riding on love to get kind of, somewhere where you belong. Jnana yoga is then a bit more dry and intellectual in a way. So because when you're talking about how, when you go, if you go and sometimes sing and dance with the Hare Krishnas, which I think anyone should do if they have a possibility. I'm not a Hare Krishna myself, but I mean, I have sang and danced with them, and I thought it was great. When I have gone to like ISKCON temple, Vaishnavi temple, local one actually in Helsinki sometimes. I don't feel love towards anything. I just love the dancing and singing. And that's more like perhaps the young Gyan.
No, well, I would disagree. I would say that is equally bhakti. If you enjoy that, then I would say if you conjure that state through the singing itself, but maybe this is just,
Yeah,
technical.
you're trying to get through the coin instead of flipping it. So let's not go there. No, but to kind of describe the difference, I think shouldn't use that example because then it gets a bit flimsy, the whole thought. But in Jnana Yoga, the idea is not as much perhaps the question of like feeling and, well, I think I should describe it more superficially, because if we go into like the deeper meanings, they all turn the same, and then you got to just cross through the coin. But if you look at it superficially, if in Bhakti Yoga you might be like writing poetry like full of love towards something which we then can, like, for example, describe as some kind of higher state or higher being, or just like existence. You might like write poetry, you might sing songs, like dancing, and you might also do puja. You might like have, I mean, now again we're using the Vaishnavite example. You might have like small statues of something which for everyone else would then seem like just like a picture of God, and you do like honorable things towards it. But the whole idea is that you're kind of you're in a way you're in love, and you are showing it and you are writing about it. And the Gyan way is more like dry and philosophical. It doesn't like feel dry if you're doing it, but it's more like you're kind of trying to understand in a way, like how come existence is actually like, in a way, it's everything is one, but you're trying to understand it. You're trying to kind of analyze it, and you're perhaps reading like the yoga philosophers to get an understanding of how is like consciousness, how is it like built up from just like one unity into this world of different objects and different feelings and different thoughts. So you're trying to, in a way, kind of trace it all back by using analytical thinking, and I mean also meditation, but you're trying to kind of meditate, and then afterwards perhaps you might try and understand, like, how come within meditation the world seems like this? Like how do you understand the fact that then when you open your eyes and start living within the world, it seems like the world is just full of different interests and different things? And of course, I mean, if we take like the shortcut and move towards the middle of the coin, of course, like these two different sides, the Jnana and the Bhakti Yoga, they all kind of, I would say they all discover the same thing, that there's this huge connection within everything.
Yeah, and I would like to say that if bhakti kind
Mm-hmm.
of discards all logic to move beyond logic, then I
Mm-hmm.
would say that Gyan uses logic to then move beyond logic, if you understand.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know if you've had, I'm sure you must have, I've had that experience definitely, that you go so deeply into a matter with
Mm-hmm.
your, I wouldn't even say just like thinking, but like with your kind of reflecting, or like just trying to, with your mind, um, access the deepest truth of a matter, to the point where the matter sort of in the end dissolves and you're left in that state of whoa. So I would say that's my understanding of Gyan Yoga, that you kind of, by trying to really get into all of these, but it's not like this very superficial philosophical like discourse and then you can sit and debate for hours and you don't get anywhere and you just get like fed up on your like debating partner and you start like, that's not the purpose of Gyan Yoga as far as I can see, to gain like knowledge to your mind that you can sit and be wise about, which I've sported with a lot of years, unfortunately too. But actually, like you really like you can take one small thing and you can like delve deep into that and really like meditate on it, and like you said, try to understand on a deeper level how existence is as it is. And then
Mm,
by that understanding, you kind of become one with that
mm.
understanding.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, an interesting thing actually about this is that if you look at what happened to philosophy in the
Your
Western
mic
world.
is moving a bit towards your shirt. Just wanted to say it's like
It has
making a
this.
bit of noise.
Oh no, I hope it hasn't had it for long. But anyways, um, where was I? Yeah, about philosophy. If you look like what has happened to Western philosophy, like after the contact with like the Orient, I mean, getting to know Indian thought, I think it's actually really interesting to see how, because I've also studied Western philosophy, like when I was younger, before I met my teacher and dove into that world. Mm, uh, Also Western philosophy, when trying to dive really deep into like the foundations of consciousness, it gets really similar to the yogic view of like consciousness and what's behind it and what's on. So so in a way, yeah, it's quite close. No, it's quite far. I mean, it's quite far from, I think, are we reaching the deadline for when, we have recorded enough for today, because worlds are starting to kind of just jump around. But anyway, when you move, I mean, you're quite far then from this part of philosophy where you're perhaps like analyzing different logical rules, for example, in language, which is a big part of Western philosophy. But then there's the whole philosophy of mind, which is also a huge part of Western philosophy. And within the philosophy of mind, you're getting really close to classical yogic Jnana kind of yogic thinking. So that, I think that just goes to show, just exactly as also Bhakti yogi has, I mean, as you very well know, I don't know if we should dwell into that subject now. I mean, Bhakti yogi as a tradition is really close to similar traditions within other cultures, or well, religions, because if you can see Bhakti yoga as a part of Hinduism as well. But,
You can,
yeah.
of course, but for example, personally, I don't associate it with that. And I think that's one aspect um, of again yoga that I think has had been watered down because it does have this connotation. For example, we usually try to break down when we're having retreats or courses, and if we're, for
Mm,
example, doing anything with mantras or we're singing kirtan, for example, which can be seen as a devotional singing, we
mm,
try to break down sort of what does it mean when you, for example, sing to Krishna? Are you
mm,
actually trying to like sing to this being, this like God figure, and do you have to believe in Krishna to actually sing? And we're trying to also open up for the possibility of seeing this devotion and these symbols as manifestations of energy and manifestations of different dimensions of existence, for example. So in that sense, I would say, for example, personally, I don't need that like context of that's again like coming back also to the mystic side. Like I don't feel very at home within any one system. So to kind of just like conform into some other person's view on things has never really worked. And there I think, yeah, that's where also the Gyan and the Bhakti unite, because when you go deeply into the philosophical parts, you would arrive at the same place as you would through just directing your energy towards that same aspect, but through energy, through emotion. And then
mm.
if someone is listening and is like, oh my God, this is so far out, and I am neither very devotional nor do I feel inclined to sit down and just ponder on things. Like I do things. Well, then we come into one other aspect of yoga, which is karma yoga. And I think maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's time that we talk about that as well, so we can sort of get a good, nice rounding up of this subject. So
Mm-hmm.
karma yoga is a very hands-on approach to how to practice presence and union in your daily life. Because if you're a bhakti yogi, maybe you're jumping around in your orange garbs and you're like singing all day, and someone is like, that's not, I can't do that for a living. I don't want to join a cult. And I can't just like write poetry all day because I need to get an income. And someone else is like, yeah, I can't either be a philosopher because like I have children to feed and, so on. So then you can,
But we
you
have to
can
remember that there's also philosophers who have children to feed.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah,
True.
yeah.
So all of these combinations exist. But the point is like someone might feel like, these are very sort of high fly kind of things or not just, fitting their personalities. And we're of course all different concoctions of different things. But karma yoga is the practice of achieving this union through action. So basically through karma yoga you could say you don't have to even do any sort of external spiritual practice, i.e., sit on your yoga mat or sing a song or like think about things in a structured way, but you can just like go around and live your life as long as you do it with the intention of in that action being present. And I think one vital thing of karma yoga, which is mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita also, which is maybe not such an orthodox text. I don't know if you would agree, but well, maybe it is too, but it's anyways like it's part of a bigger epic. And within this small section, you have again, you have Krishna talking to Arjuna, who is I'm not going to go into the story, but he's preparing for battle and he's having some doubts, and Krishna is advising him. And then he goes into tell, Krishna goes into tell about the different aspects of yoga. And karma yoga there, he says, to renounce the fruits of your actions is karma yoga. So when you do an action and you don't expect any specific outcome from it, but you're doing it the best you can, and then you're kind of saying, now anything is fine with me. If anything happens with this thing I did, that's fine. And that's karma yoga. You're detaching yourself from sort of taking the honor or the shame, for that matter, for whatever you did. So living in that way and kind of carrying out your daily tasks the best way you can and without attaching yourself to it, that will bring you to that state of union as well. And please continue.
No, I just think perhaps for the listener for whom this is a really kind of a new word or new name, the word karma might be like familiar from like a really different, or well, in a way, kind of different context. So can you describe why karma can be like both this idea of your actions becoming in some way something that comes back to haunt you if you've done something bad, and how karma is then in this world? Why is karma also then in the
Well,
name
if
karma yoga?
karma is, an action or an
Yeah.
act, then I think, the way that people hear karma, like very simply explained, is yeah, like if you're doing something bad, you will,
Mm,
get something bad done at some point. And in one way, I mean, you could say that that's just a very sort of simplified way of seeing universal law, like whatever
mm,
energy is put out will exist in the universe and at some point will aim to even out. So that's just like basic, the universe is homeostasis, like it's trying to keep up a balance. And
mm,
then people attach it to, fatalism and all kinds of, maybe even magical thinking. And I guess, it's fine. You can see that just as a way of explaining a natural phenomena.
mm,
But karma yoga would be using that same sort of understanding that whatever you do will affect you if you actually let it affect you. So
mm,
if you're doing something and you're like very attached to it, then of course it will have some impact on you. Because if you're like writing your doctor's thesis and you're like very ambitious and you want to have a high grade and then you get a low, grade in it, and like everyone disses your, work, then you're
That's
going to be very
terrible.
sad.
Yeah.
And instead, Karma Yoga says, do it the best you can, but then like don't care. And that might be like for someone very difficult because they're very invested in what they perceive to be their identity, which is the personality and the body. And the yogis say you're getting a bit limited if you actually all the time attach everything you do to this thing that you perceive to be you.
Mm,
And if you
mm,
stop all the time taking the credit and taking the blame, then you're not going to be affected by success and failure, but instead you're going to have a more, and I'm not going to say it's like going to be a flatline kind of life, but you're going to ride through these ups and downs with much greater ease because you're not going to be so clingy about all the states that life inevitably brings.
mm.
And I think that's how you can kind of understand karma as definitely an existence and a reality, because, you know, like, was it Newton who said that? Or now am I maybe even like
I
far
think
off?
that's Newton. It's one of Newton's laws that every action has a reaction. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's just like even the most skeptical person who's, at least admitting some truth to Western science would be able to say, okay, that's a law. So then you can just see, like, how do you get free of that law? Because inevitably when you live, you're going to have to act. Otherwise, if you don't act at all, meaning if your cells don't even act, then you're going to be dead and non-existent. So as long as you're continuing to act, i.e. live, there's going to be things happening. And to not live a miserable life where you're always fighting for pleasure and trying to avoid pain, just do it, and like don't care too much about what's going on, like as a, yeah, you don't put energy into your actions in a way that you're like hoping for something, and then you won't get any sort of feedback either from the universe, if you want to see it that way.
Mm. Yeah, and I think also, I mean, you can also see karma yoga as one of the like more than kind of socially, I don't know, responsible, but socially kind of linked parts of yoga, because there's also the idea that what you're doing, I mean, if you look at it, it's also the idea of what you're doing is just like, it's not only for yourself. I mean, it's also the idea that you're giving away. And I mean, you might think it might be a description of like you're giving away the fruit of what you're doing to like the the universe or whatever, like cosmic. But you can also think that you're actually just like what you're doing, the fruit of what you're doing is like you're giving it away. You're giving it away to everyone else. And in the same way as just as you said, like you're not that focused to in what way what you are doing is going to reward yourself. And well, I think it's a huge wisdom in the whole concept, which also is a part of yoga, which could be a bit more kind of well, I don't know, it could be kind of affecting in a positive way much more than it does today, because I don't think that the whole concept and idea is really in the like knowledge of the greater public. But I think if karma yoga would be something that would be like even as an idea taught to younger people all over the world, it would be perhaps lessening the whole burnout, huge anxiety over reaching goals that are perhaps not that accessible. It would lessen all this burden, because if you only could think that what you're doing, first of all, that what you are doing, you should try and do it in a good spirit. I mean, not like in this whole anxious, you are forcing yourself. I think when you use the word you should do do the best you can, they should also be like, remember that it's not like meaning this whole concept of get everything out of yourself, like maximize your input. The idea is that you do your best and that's enough. I mean,
Exactly.
the point
Yeah,
of it's
because
actually enough.
that's to
That's
do it in a
all.
detached way, I would say.
Mm, Yeah.
And I was even thinking, I think if the modern sort of seeker would want to break down the wisdom in karma yoga, of course there's so many more aspects to it than this, but one thing that I've recently listened to is I've been listening to a few podcasts on dopamine. And
Mm,
since we have this inherent search for motivation and reward, when you do karma yoga, you kind of detach that rewarding thing from the result and you put it into the action itself, which gives you a sort of more constant motivation rather than, you have this big goal, you're going to become the fastest runner in town, and then you reach that goal and then you're suddenly like flat because all the dopamine went like down immediately because you had like attached it to that goal. So instead, when you don't have a goal, so to say, when you're not like aiming to be the best or the fastest or the richest or the most beautiful or whatever things people like generally want in life, or even be happy, like I think even that as a goal can put pressure on people. um, when you kind of put all those things aside, then naturally I think the if you would talk about it again through the dopamine, then you'll start to attach that to the action itself, which means you'll have just like this more stable sense of purpose and sense of like wanting to do things in life.
mm,
And yeah, I think there's like a great relief in also taking off that burden of success or ambition and, yeah,
mm.
just doing things for their own sake.
Yeah. And I mean, it's funny you mentioned this because I think like Western psychology and like the positive psychology, which is then the part of psychology where you're focusing on studying like positive emotions, like good emotions. They're actually, I mean, they're like reaching the same insights that has already been quite well like explained within ideas as karma yoga. So, I mean, we shouldn't go as far into this because I'm realizing that this episode is getting like really, really long. But I mean, just, well, I'm not going to add more because I think you said it just like perfectly. So, but I think it's really interesting to see how like this old Indian concept is, it's getting kind of,
Universal.
yeah, it's universal. And while studying in the Western world, you kind of reach the same insights. Anyways, but yeah, so karma yoga,
Yeah.
this is another part of yoga. So what we have today, we have dwelled upon a bit hatha yoga, ashtanga yoga, opening up all the parts of the ashtanga yoga. uh where else we went to raja yoga, with focus on like more kind of getting into meditation, a bit of like hierarchy within these different limbs. And then moving on to bhakti yoga, the yoga of love, and then jnana yoga, like the intellectual, analytical, logical yoga. And last of all, karma yoga. This is all kind
And
of yoga.
yeah, I think there are many more ways to analyze and to structure, everything that's called yoga today. But I think by having this Ashtanga yoga, we kind of broke down what maybe is mostly seen today, and that I think pertains into the Raja Yoga aspect. And then we had these other sort of traditional schools of yoga. And I think it's no point of us going even into like the different brands of yoga that people
Mm,
sometimes, I think, mistakenly assume to be different styles of yoga, so to say, or different schools of yoga, because all these brands, they anyways they fit in under one of these bigger chunks of practices. So one could just say they are different flavors of the same kind of thing. So I think for today we've covered a pretty big part of what yoga is, and obviously there's so much more detail we could go into, but like you said, we've already talked for a long time. So I mean, just big appreciation to you who've been listening and sticking with us for so long.
yeah.
And yeah, like always, we're open to questions and comments, and elaborations if we're being vague about something, or if you want to hear something specific, then please by all means write.
If you want to hear something specific, it's a bit questionable if you are listening or watching the right podcast. No, we are trying to be specific. It's just that we don't want to dive into like the small details. We're trying to get the big picture, I think. But yeah,
Yes.
please, if you want to ask us something or give us any feedback, just like write a comment. And hope to see you again. I mean, I'm saying I hope to see you, Luis, again, but I mean, we're not seeing you watch us, so hope that you want to like watch another episode, just give it a bit of time or put it on like double speed and we sound really funny or anything that might help. And we'll be back again with the new episode. We have to see like what is the next subject that we want to
Definitely.
like, evolve.
Well, thank you for today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.